Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is David Russell Jensen. My Tlingit name is Shukaguk. I'm the development officer here at Sealaska Heritage, and I'm pleased to welcome you to part of our fall lecture series. Sealaska Heritage is committed to providing accessible community programming, but none of our work could be possible without donors. You can contribute online at sealaskaheritage.org/giving. We're joined today by Jason Briner, Ph.D., a professor of geology at the University of Buffalo. Dr. Briner studies the response of ice sheets and glaciers to climate change, and he specializes in polar regions. His lecture today will present new discoveries in addition to the latest research on Southeast Alaska's ice sheet during the Ice Age. There will be an opportunity for questions at the end of the lecture. If you're here in person, please silence your cell phones. Thank you and welcome, Dr. Briner.
Research program in Southeast Alaska for the past 10 years or so. So the title of my talk is called Waking Up from the Last Ice Age. And you can see in the image in the left a modern picture of Greenland, but that's probably what Southeast Alaska looked like if we rewind the clock maybe 15 or 20,000 years. And then of course you see what Southeast Alaska looks like today. I want to start by saying Sheesh. And acknowledge that the Tlingit people have been stewards of the land on which we gather since time immemorial, and we thank them for their hospitality and stewardship of this land. Also, where I work is home of the Seneca Nation, a member of the Haudenosaunee Six Nations Confederacy. And today this region is still home of the Haudenosaunee people, and my team is grateful for the opportunity to live and work and share ideas in this territory. Moving on, in acknowledgements, I want to acknowledge my team, which consists of other professors like Charlotta Lindquist and Elizabeth Thomas and Corey Krabenhoft at the University of Buffalo, some collaborators at the Forest Service in Southeast Alaska, Jim Bechtel, recently retired from Thorn Bay, and KK Prussian in Sitka. We have a collaborator who's a professor, Rita Jensen, in Canada at the University of Alberta. And then, of course, this project would go nowhere without early career scientists, both postdocs and students. So Leah Lesnick is now a professor. She was a Ph.D. student of mine in the past and has published on some really nice work in Southeast Alaska. Caleb Walcott is a current Ph.D. student, as is Tessa McDonald, a current grad student in my program, and then Colby Moore's there too. Yeah, can you hear me okay? Do you want me to start over? Or continue?
No, continue.
Okay, great. Okay, moving on. My beginnings, it turns out I got the hook, the addiction to geology and glacier history right here in Southeast Alaska. I grew up in the Seattle area, and when I was a student at the University of Washington, I had the opportunity to be a field assistant for a PhD student by the name of Rob Vians. This is in the mid-1990s. 30 years ago from this year, I had my first ever trip to Alaska, and we studied, or I helped Rob study, basically dig around in the dirt, to try to learn about the recent history of the Shakes Glacier and the LeConte Glacier. So those are my beginnings. Since that time, my research through graduate degrees and eventually becoming a professor myself, my research took me in other directions in Canada and Greenland and elsewhere. The Ice Age. So the main beginning of my talk today in geologic history is the Ice Age. So this is an animation showing you how much of the Northern Hemisphere was covered by ice sheets and glaciers during the last Ice Age, which we also call the last glacial maximum. It turns out today, about 10% of Earth's land is covered by glaciers and ice sheets, but 20,000 years ago, 30%, 1/3 roughly, of all the land on Earth was covered by ice. This was back in the Ice Age. When you put the ocean's water in solid form on land, the ocean level drops, because that water is sitting on land instead of in the ocean. So not only were there vast changes in the Earth's cryosphere during the Ice Age, but sea level also was greatly reconfigured. Alaskans know that because, as you can see in the upper left of this image, we had a vast land bridge, it's called, connecting Alaska to Russia. So that's the Beringian land bridge. But there's also other areas around the globe where sea level greatly changed the configuration of the continents. You can see, if you can find Florida on this map, you can see it's a bit wider than it is today. If you can find Indonesia on this map, you can see it's not a bunch of islands, but it's one sort of connected landmass in with Southeast Asia. So moving back now to Southeast Alaska, why did I come back to Southeast Alaska? And the research question that brought my attention back to Southeast Alaska after being gone for 20 years relates to ice sheets and North American ancestry. So the map that's shown here is a common map in archaeology, and it shows the hypothesized migration routes of how the native ancestors colonized North America from Asia. And there's a couple of different routes, the route in blue, there's a route in red, and recently there's been a lot more attention on this route in red, the so-called coastal route. It's thought that peoples migrated down the coastline or were settling in this area during the Ice Age, basically, and this was maybe a gateway for the colonization of the rest of the Americas. So there's questions about this coastal route versus the blue route, the inland corridor route. So there's a question of timing and what was the shape and size of the ice sheets, and were the ice sheets blocking these routes at a certain point in time? And so these questions needed some additional work. Back to an animation of ice sheet change in North America. If you now focus on Southeast Alaska, there's an ice sheet there called the Cordilleran ice sheet. And there's not a lot of, although this animation makes it look like we have it all sorted, turns out there's a lot of uncertainties about the animations in this map, in these series of maps. And in Southeast Alaska, there's some big question marks about the timing of the past ice cover. So zooming in to Southeast Alaska, here's 4 maps of the same area. And the 4 maps are different depictions of ice extent in Southeast Alaska. And they all show something that's really interesting, and it's not commonly seen everywhere in the high northern latitudes at the Ice Age. They show what are referred to as glacial refugia, pieces of the landscape that survived glacial cover, that weren't fully occupied by the ice sheet. These maps in time are from this last glacial maximum time period in the general ballpark of 20,000 years ago. And in these maps, you can see, like if you look at the far right one, for example, you see a bunch of little pieces of land that are protruding out from the edge of the ice. Furthermore, in gray, there's these little gray shaded areas. And in gray, what that is remember earlier when we talked about how, well, all the ice on land, global sea levels were low. In gray are some of the areas of the continental shelf that were sticking above sea level. Sea level dropped, and that exposed some dry areas of land that are now covered by the ocean. So all these maps show these really interesting areas of ice not covering the entire landscape, and we wanted to learn more about that. Now, there's not just these maps, but there's other evidence that there might have been some places in Southeast Alaska that escaped glaciation. So this slide is on the case for refugia in Southeast Alaska. If you find some sediments that were deposited just after the ice went away and look at pollen grains in those sediments, you instantly see tree pollen. And the question is, if this area was all covered with ice, how would tree pollen get here so quickly if it had to come up from like Seattle as soon as the ice here started to retreat? How could trees colonize from so far away so quickly? So the idea is, well, maybe there's a local source. There's local little spots where forests survived. So did trees survive in glacial refugia is an open question in research right now. Similarly, there's some genetic evidence for some unique populations in Southeast Alaska that also hint at glacial refugia existing. There's a really interesting story with brown bear genetics and different breeds, basically genetic breeds of bears on the different islands in Southeast Alaska. So were brown bears isolated in refugia during the LGM? Okay. So I've talked about how I'm interested in this problem of glacial refugia in Alaska, but what is my role exactly in this question? To answer that, we're going to go to outer space. In outer space, out there, there's all this radiation coming from all the stars flying and zooming around, and some of that radiation comes down and hits Earth. Turns out clever people, way before me, have figured out something tricky to do with that radiation. Turns out that that radiation we call cosmic radiation, and the cosmic radiation comes down and bombards our planet. Some of the high energy particles go down and hit the Earth's crust and the rocks and stuff, and they make new isotopes, new chemical. They change the chemistry of the surface of the Earth the more they're exposed to this cosmic radiation. Let me tell you how it works in terms of glaciers. One of the new isotopes or elements that it creates is beryllium-10. The natural beryllium on Earth is beryllium-9. But if you look around in surface rocks on the planet, you see this weird variety of beryllium called beryllium-10, and it's only produced due to the reaction of the bombardment of, from cosmic radiation from outer space. So let's start here. There's a glacier, and it's on the land. And when it's on the land, it's blocking the land from getting dosed by this cosmic radiation. But out beyond the glacier, the land is getting hit by cosmic radiation, and the geochemistry out there is changing. Like sticking your arm out in the sun for a long time, you're getting tanner and tanner and tanner the longer your arm is sticking out in the sun. Right now, my sleeve is the glacier. If I were to roll, and my hand is getting really tan hands. Happens a lot in the Arctic in the summertime. And you roll up your sleeve, and all of a sudden, your upper arm can start to get tanned. So that's kind of the analogy here. So if we remove the glacier, or have the glacier get smaller, all of a sudden, a piece of ground that wasn't previously exposed to cosmic radiation is now exposed. The geochemistry starts to change as a function of time. The beryllium-10, that little molecule I'm interested in, builds up and accumulates through time. So if we were to go out to a site like that, here's my graduate student Caleb Walcott sampling a piece of the Earth's surface in Southeast Alaska, take a few rock chips, bring them back to the lab, measure the geochemistry of that rock, we can determine the age when the glacier went away and that rock was exposed to cosmic radiation. So what we did, me and my students over the years, we went to all these glacial refugia areas. We had a tool now that would allow us to assess, kind of for the first time, whether these areas were indeed ice-free or were they covered by ice. And if they were covered by ice, when did that ice go away? I will never forget one summer day, after waiting in Sitka for a week for the weather to clear out, finally the sky was clear enough for us to go down with a helicopter, land on this outcrop of rock. As we were coming in for a landing, I looked out the window and I said, no glacial refugia here. Because I could already tell this rock is so smooth and glacially carved that the glacier was there relatively recently. So that's Caleb. Before Caleb was Aaliyah, and then now there's Tessa McDonald, sorry, Tessa, not Tess. And this group of students and I are going to all these refugia locations to do this dating method based on this cosmic radiation to try to figure out if the ice was there, and if it was there, when it went away. The other thing glaciers do is they bulldoze the land and they move around big boulders, glacial erratic boulders. And here's a glacial erratic boulder we found in a refugia location. And we did our geochemistry test on the surface of that boulder, and we got an age of 16,300 years. So it says to us, and these are all the places where we did these dating methods. Many of the red dots along the outer coast are the refugia locations. We also worked farther inland to try to pace the retreat of the ice out of the archipelago at the end of the Ice Age. So what we found in all these formerly refugia areas was, in fact, none show glacial refugia. Not all, but none. So these 6 red circles are places where we went. So we targeted places that had previously been mapped as ice-free. And we basically discovered that in most of these places, or actually all 6 of these places, the ice was there. Okay. So where was the ice edge then, if it's not in this latest one of these depictions? We don't know. This is still a puzzle for us to solve in the future. Here's maybe one guess. There's a question mark at Mount Edgecombe, that's right near Sitka, because that's an area of active research now, and we don't yet know exactly if Mount Edgecombe survived being covered by the ice sheet or not. So that's a place where we're working. I do want to point out, however, that there are areas, even beyond my little scribbled red line, that might have been above sea level and ice-free. So there are potential places for refugia. Maybe these are now below sea level. This is why underwater archaeology and Kelly's work is so important, because these are the areas that we might be turning to next to try to find evidence of environments, potentially archaeology, that existed way back during the Ice Age in this part of the world. Okay, I want to return to the timing part. I showed you a boulder earlier that we dated to 16,300 years ago. Let's explore that a little bit further. And to do that, we're going to go to caves. There are a lot of caves in Southeast Alaska, especially in the southern part where there's limestone bedrock, carbonate bedrock that dissolves in rainwater and makes caves. Work before my time from Professor Tim Heaton has resulted in a lot of fossil bone finds in caves in southern Southeast Alaska. I'm going to tell you today about the bone record from one of the caves called Shukaka. So here's this small little cave entrance into Shukaka, but it turned out it's an enormously important cave. Now, what you're looking at here is a plot of different animal bone types found in this cave. Cave bone ages from southeastern Alaska. Most of these, if not all of them, are from Shukaka. And the different colored dots are the different kinds of animals that have bones in the cave. And the timeline running along the bottom from 0 to 50,000 years ago, these are all the radiocarbon ages from carbon dating of these bones. So simply by finding a bone and carbon dating the bone and throwing it on a plot like this and repeating that times 100 or however many dates there are there, you get a sense of the picture of not only what animals have lived in the area and when, but also, oh yeah, here's an example. Here are some bones that are found in Shukaka from the ringed seal. That's the light blue dots on the topmost part of the graph. And then here's pictures of all the other animals there. So not only do you have an amazing view of the animal assemblage that lived near this cave for that huge time frame, you also get a sense that about the ice sheet cover history. Was this cave covered by a glacier for the last 50,000 years? Clearly not, because we have all these animals thriving in this part of the world. There is, however, one gap right here from about 20 to about 17,000 years ago. And even the young end of that range is based on one ringed seal bone age. Then there's more, starts to be more ages about 15, starting about 15,000. But we have this gap. We think that this gap is when the cave entrance was covered by the Cordilleran ice sheet. Shukaka Cave is in northern Prince of Wales Island. It's not on the outermost coast, it's in a little bit, inland a little bit, but not too far. So we think this cave entrance was covered by the ice sheet in this particular time interval. It makes sense. This is the time period in the world when it's the glacial maximum time period. And if you interpret the animals that lived there as representing the climate, you see a lot of ringed seal, which are sea ice habitat animals in that 25 to 15,000 year range. This is a cold time in Prince of Wales Island. At the end of this gap is when we start to have all of our cosmic geochemistry ages, like this boulder that was 16,300. So we think that that kind of fits together, the cave with a lot of the ages that we're getting, and I'm going to come back to this a little bit later in the talk. What I want to do now is think about sea level. This is another part of the story when we think about glaciers, the sea level, as I talked about in the early stages of this presentation. Okay. If you put a load, say of ice, on the Earth's crust, the crust depresses under its weight. Much like if you see a black bear sitting on your trampoline in your backyard. It gets pushed down. Okay. So we think that Southeast Alaska, when the ice was here, pushed down the crust. Now, when the ice goes away, Juneau, Alaska goes flinging up into the air, like this bear. We have a rising crust where the ice was thickest, but also, like if you were to lay, another analogy is if you were to lay down in a waterbed. At the edge, if you were to put your hands out and touch with your fingertips the surface of the waterbed, it would be above maybe the former level. And that's called, it's bulging up there. And in geology, we have the same terms for that. We call it the forebulge. And that's these areas that are rising on the fringes of the depressed area in the middle of that cartoon. Okay. So here's Juneau, and there's Sitka in this particular map. Okay. So if we were in Juneau and the ice goes away at the close of the last ice age, Juneau is going to be popping out of the ocean. If we were in Sitka, Alaska, at the close of the last ice age, after the ice goes away, it actually might be relaxed. The crust might be relaxing a little bit. If we were to look at it and make a little graph of that. So here's a little chart. It's going from old to young, left to right. The blue is covered by ice, and then right upon deglaciation in Juneau, we're having sea level fall. Because the ocean's here, the crust is rising out of the ocean. That's local sea level fall then in that case. In Sitka, on the other hand, we might, in the very beginning, we have sea level rise because the forebulge is collapsing into the ocean. Simultaneously, however, with these crustal changes, we have the glacial oceans filling back up because of all the melting ice sheets. So we have sort of a competing factor. Meanwhile, crust is doing its thing, but the global ocean elsewhere is the bathtub's starting to fill back up from the melting ice elsewhere. So these are competing effects, but in general, we have these two shapes depending where you are in Southeast Alaska. Now, does anyone in here know what's happening with sea level in Juneau today? Is it rising or falling, or staying the same? It's falling. Do we know why that is? Same concept, isostatic rebound. This is an isostatic rebound hotspot right now in Juneau today. In fact, Juneau, I read, has uplifted about 10 feet in the last couple hundred years because of the retreat of recent glaciers in the surrounding area. So these maps show that. Here's the one on the left is this bullseye pattern of the uplift rate in this part of the world, and then on the right is the uplift amount in meters. And that's because you're in an area where there's a lot of glaciation, and all those glaciers are getting thinner, and the mass is getting smaller, and then the crust is rebounding. So the same thing happened at the end of the ice age in Southeast Alaska as well. How do we know that 15,000 years ago in Juneau, sea level was falling, and in Sitka, sea level was rising? Does anyone know how we reconstruct these things? trees. We have a colleague who's really good at finding shells. You can find clam shells way above sea level. So here's a picture I took from this summer on Baranof Island from some sediments some meters above modern sea level, above the tidal range. So you know these sediments had to get there, the ocean had to be at that site or above at that time period. You see all the shells in this sediment package? This is what geologists do. They're good at digging around in dirt, finding things. Well, in Spalding Meadows here, not too far out of town, at 600 feet above sea level, there are clam shells. Juneau was like that black bear flying off the trampoline. It really popped out of the ocean at the close of the last ice age. Those shells date to 14,000 years. So I want to tell you about Jim's work. This is a paper that Jim Bechtel led a few years back, where he compiled 700 different places throughout the archipelago with evidence that ocean sediments are now far above present-day sea level. More than 200 individual carbon ages on all those shells. And I'm going to run you through a graph now. And the graph is going to show the sea level reconstructions from this paper. So you can see the vertical scale bar on the right in meters, above sea level, above zero, and below sea level in the negative values. And then the timeline here is the ice age to today. 20,000 years ago on the left, running up to present. Now, there's some vertical lines on here which are like known global climate events that we don't need to pay too much attention to. That's when the ice sheet was big over southeast Alaska. CIS is Cordilleran ice sheet, maximum extent. And it turns out the data are generated or compartmentalized into different parts of southeast Alaska, because different parts of southeast Alaska had different sea level histories, as we're about to look at. These vertical lines, there's one at zero, and then there's ones way below zero, and these are places in the seafloor today where there's like beach lines that are well below modern sea level. And those are data. We don't always have this submerged beach line dated, but they do give us a clue that at one point the sea level was way down there. Now here is some data. Now I'm finally throwing on some data on top of the chart. These data show sea level rise from about 14 to about 10,000 years ago, and then it kind of levels off. And indeed, these data are from the forebulge part of the trampoline, or the waterbed. They're from the outer part, not the part that was loaded so much. So when the ice goes away, basically the forebulge collapses, the global bathtub is filling back up, and that mostly results in a big episode of sea level rise there. Now there's a bunch of other data I just threw on here at once, but I want you to draw your attention to the red data points and the red line. Those are the data from the Juneau area. And they show, just as I suggested earlier, this is sea level fall, meaning 14,000 years ago, sea level was about 200 meters, there's our 600 feet, above today, and since that time it has come down because the land has popped out of the ocean. Okay, so that's the sea levels part of the story. We have areas with sea level rise and areas of sea level fall, all in a pretty small region of southeast Alaska. It's a very interesting story, and it took years of work and in Jim's great passion to do this work to pull this together. So here then are all the elevations of how high the sea got in these areas. 8 meters and 18 meters on the outer part of the archipelago. It eventually did get higher than present a little bit because the global bathtub was filling up a lot and there was maybe a little bit of adjustment out there. But the biggest values are where there's huge sea level fall, like Juneau, that number, 229 meters. That's just ridiculous. So here's the western islands, then part of the islands is the forebulge collapse area, and the inner part is the isostatic rebound area. So the center of the cartoon versus the fringe. I want to just take this cartoon now and revisit the where are the refugia question. Because So back to refugia for a moment. It's possible during the Ice Age, places that the glacier didn't get to were actually pushed out of the ocean a little bit from this forebulge process. It also means that these areas that are in this bulging part collapsed and now submerged under the ocean. So it kind of makes sense that because of this forebulge collapse, all the archives of the ecosystem and potentially the archaeology were actually above sea level and beyond the ice edge, but now they're really hard to get to spots below the sea. It makes that underwater archaeology really important. Okay, I've talked about glacier history, I've talked about sea level change, I've talked about caves, I've talked about outer space. I want to put all this stuff together. And I'm going to build a timeline, again, one of these graphs. Again, it's going to go from 20,000 on the left, and it's going to run up to 0 on the right. The first thing that I'm plotting here is a little piece of data called IRD, which is ice rafted debris. People looked at sediment cores in the ocean, and in the certain interval in time out there in the ocean, offshore of Southeast Alaska, the mud contains all sorts of sand grains. And the only way sand grains get way out there into the ocean, offshore Southeast Alaska, is people think from icebergs. Icebergs being calved off of the vast glaciers that filled the archipelago, all these channels and sounds, calved off dirty icebergs, they floated out into the ocean and rained down sand grains that are now in the mud column down there at that time period. So from 18, that's the base of the record actually, up to about 15,000 years ago, lots of sand grains we think from icebergs. Now we go up to our direct glacial evidence. The cave, the horizontal orange bar is the cave gap. The orange dots are the different times of our ages from our cosmic dating. Okay, so it all kind of lines up there, that when the glaciers went away, we have timing of the boulders they left behind, the ice rafted debris in the ocean is getting deposited, and it all kind of stops around maybe between 15 and 14,000 years ago. I want to just touch on Mount Edgecombe here, this beautiful mountain off the sound from Sitka, viewed from Sitka here. Turns out volcanoes have their magma chambers in the crust, the same thing that the ice is pushing on when the glacier comes over. And it turns out those two aren't unrelated. That when a glacier gets put on top of a piece of crust with a magma chamber in it, it influences that magma chamber. And wouldn't you know it, but when the ice goes away, the new piece of data here is that these red spikes. When the ice goes away, that magma chamber relaxes. It's not stuffed down into the crust anymore. It decompresses. Commonly around on Earth, all over the Earth, at the end of an ice age, when you remove an ice load from a piece of crust, like an area that's volcanic, like Iceland, the volcanoes have a party. And they go exploding. Some of these eruptions about 14,000 years ago were so big from Mount Edgecombe that their ash layers are here in Juneau. So it looks like this period of lots of volcanism coming out of Mount Edgecombe also aligns. It's 14, maybe 15,000 years ago. This aligns with when the crust is really starting to relax out there. Forebulge changes, ice load is being moved, and we have a lot of volcanism in that specific time period. The final piece then is sea level. And now we throw sea level on here, so out there on the western islands, the sea level's coming up. This is an example from the outer islands. Sea level's coming up, and then there's some changes. It's a little bit higher than today, and then it kind of relaxes right into today's level. So that's basically what we've learned, or a lot of the conclusions we've made, but science, as you know, is always ongoing. These are some of the things we've learned so far, but I want to talk about what's next in the last 5 or 10 minutes of this talk. And I would say right now we only have half the story. We have the half on the left side of the graph, but there's a lot of information for us to learn about on the right side of this graph. And these are some of the areas that my crew is working on these days. So we're curious, in the last maybe 14, 12,000 years, what has climate change been like in Southeast Alaska? How has the ecosystem responded to changing climates, coming out of the Ice Age, waking up from the Ice Age, coming into the modern, rather warm period? We know, from just what we talked about with the sea level changes in Juneau, that there has been a recent major ice unloading, and Juneau is again popping out of the ocean. Well, if we rewind the clock a little bit earlier, we know that in Glacier Bay, there was a lot of glacier advance that pushed the crust into the sea and displaced peoples living there. And then now that cycle is over and we're popping back out. So there actually have been a lot of natural climate changes since the Ice Age ended, since we woke up from the Ice Age. So we're interested in ecosystem response to those kinds of changes. Can we quantify those kinds of climate changes? What's the glacier evolution like that I just talked about? We need more data on that. There's this whole crustal motion thing that relates heavily to sea level. In fact, Juneau's sea level future relates to our ability to maybe model the crustal motions to understand local sea level change and then also the volcanic history. So I want to run you through a couple of things that are ongoing. Here's our colleague Britta looking at more mud. And the mud here, you see stripes. These stripes are ash layers. This is on Baranof Island. This is above younger sediments than that 14,000 years ago time interval with so much volcanism. We are curious, we are finding some evidence that Mount Edgecombe has been active more recently. So we're interested to explore that. We are also using DNA now in this kind of research. It's amazing like how things have evolved. Here's a lake on Sumez Island in just west of Prince of Wales. We go out there with our boats and our tubes and we pound the tube in the bottom of the lake and we pull up a core, sediment core. And what we're able to do now with our colleague Charlotta Lindquist at University of Buffalo is she's in the biology department. She's able to take a piece of that mud and sequence the DNA out of it. It's called ancient DNA or sometimes ancient sedimentary ancient DNA. And she's able to take that sediment, sequence a bunch of stuff, and reconstruct the vegetation in the ecosystem at those time periods. Not from pollen grains, which would be another way to do it, but from the DNA. So this is a chart showing her reconstruction of a bunch of different plants and stuff that lived by Sumez Lake. This was our first stab. Sumez Lake was our pilot. And the core that we got goes back only 11,800 years, you see on the lower left. Well, we know that the Ice Age ended before that, so been really looking hard for the last 5 years to find sediments that go all the way back to 15,000 when the ice went away. We finally found a lake. It's called Parrot Lake, and it's on Dahl Island, again off the west coast of Prince of Wales, further south. We were able to get out to that lake a few years ago, and we got a sediment core that we radiocarbon dated at the very bottom to be about 15,000 years. The transition of the mud you see here, it gets younger as you go up to the left. On to the right is the older part. So the oldest part of our mud core is kind of like clay-y looking. That's probably when there was still a glacier nearby. And then it gets more brown, and that's waking up from the Ice Age. The lowest, that transition from clay to brown, we had a little fossil piece of plant, a bunch of little pieces of plants that we dated to 15,000. And we have a bunch of other dates on this core, so we have a pretty good core there going back 15,000. Ongoing work right now is to apply those DNA techniques to these sediment layers. Okay, Dr. Elizabeth Thomas, also at University of Buffalo, she's into molecules, organic molecules. And that's Sam, not Elizabeth. He's a postdoc. And he was with Elizabeth this summer in some lakes near Sitka on Baranof Island, collecting more tubes of mud. And what Elizabeth does is she studies the molecules that are like they're fossil molecules also in those sediments. Just like there's fossil DNA in those sediments, there's all sorts of like plant molecules. Molecules are made up of elements, and those elements sometimes can have different isotopes. She looks at the isotopes within those molecules to reconstruct past climate changes. So we're really excited to learn more and more about the climate history of this region with some of these new techniques. Here's a crew I was with last summer in June on Baranof Lake, which is a big lake by Baranof Warm Springs on the inland side of Baranof Island. And here's my coring boat, and we were collecting more tubes of mud there. Baranof Lake is here. We made a new bathymetric chart of Baranof Lake. We had a fish finder, and we went pinballed all the way around that lake, back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and made this map. That lake is more than 300 feet deep in the upper middle part of it up there, just off from the U.S. Forest Service cabin site. What I'm not showing in this map is to the left of the map are the big mountains of central Baranof Island. Those mountains have glaciers on them. Those glaciers are transporting sediment. The glacier rivers are putting sediment down in, landing in Baranof Lake. So on the right is another one of these mud cores, and the layers in this core can be interpreted so we can understand how the glaciers up valley feeding Baranof Lake have changed through time. So we're hoping to use the layers in Baranof Lake to understand how the glaciers in central Baranof Island have changed a little bit. Something else we did in Sitka is we're trying to work a little bit more towards community engagement. We partnered with the Sitka Sound Science Center and had an outreach day at Swan Lake, which is in the middle of the municipality of Sitka. And we went out there, and with the equipment that we had for our research in the area, we put that on Swan Lake, and we brought up some cores of the sediment layers from the bottom of Swan Lake. And we've assembled this flyer that we're going to be distributing to the community soon. Turns out Swan Lake used to be below sea level, and then it like popped up a little bit. And the sediments in our pamphlet on the left side is another one of these, you can tell I like these pictures of sediment cores. Another one of these sediment core pictures, and in the bottom we're pulling clamshells out of the mud in our core from Swan Lake. And now it's 30 feet above sea level. So most of the sea level change that happened in Sitka in the early waking of the Ice Age was sea level rise, but it overshot, went up to about 35 feet in elevation, and then came back to zero. Swan Lake helps us piece that together. Okay, I want to make one last point. Again, just to show you that science is never solved. There's always new stuff to do, and just when you think you got something figured out, you get a curveball. Okay, so when did people arrive in North America? The when kind of keeps changing and maybe even getting older. So there was this Clovis first hypothesis that people got in the lower part of the US, in the North America 13,000 years ago. Then there was some DNA research and other work that suggested maybe 16,000. There is a latest piece to this, and we'll see if it stands the test of time. I've seen the work. There's been a number of papers. I'm an expert in dating methods, and I've looked at the dating methods at this site, and they're pretty solid. The other thing you need at an archaeological site to show that people were there is not only well-dated sites, but evidence, strong evidence that they were people living there. Footprints look pretty convincing to me. It kind of adds up to be a pretty solid site that sent shockwaves through the community that suggests that humans were in the lower 48 parts of the US today during the Ice Age 23,000 years ago. And there have been rebuttals to this work, and then there's been in defense of this work, and it's kind of, so far, seems to be standing the test of time, this finding. I want to return to this animation, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the next slide and freeze it in the very beginning at 25,000 years ago. So our friend, the inland corridor hypothesis, see the separation of those two ice sheets, the Cordilleran ice sheet and the big one's called the Laurentide ice sheet, 25,000 years ago. A lot of the coastal route could be open too at that time period, so we don't know exactly if this site holds up to be true. We don't know exactly when the migration, where the migration went through, but it is interesting to think that humans could have got south of the ice sheets before the ice sheets were there. That's what the finding kind of implies. So with that, I'll wrap it up and say thank you once again.
Well, we have time for some questions if anybody has any burning.
Jason, thank you for that. It was an amazing amalgamation of all of this work. But my question for you is very much on your last point, which I've been planning on asking, and then you get to it. But how do we find what the sea level was and where the glaciers were precisely in Southeast Alaska before the last glacial maximum?
Well, that's a great question. I think, as you're well aware, there have been more and more sophisticated swath bathymetry and sonar types of recordings. We have these submerged shoreline benches carved into the seafloor. With some of the methods that I use in my research, it would be great to have rovers out there getting samples. Even if we don't find archaeological sites, just getting samples. For example, Mount Edgecombe, it sends lava out. In the past, it sent lava out from its eruptive center down the flanks of the volcano. When that lava, just like in Hawaii today, intersects the ocean, it creates a certain type of landform called pillow lava. And you could go down there with that rover and collect some samples down there and date, basically, the age of the lava as it's hitting the ocean 180 meters below modern sea level. So, for example, one could do some work on these shorelines that are way down below the ocean, more mapping. The ocean, yeah, exploring more of the ocean.
We have an online question. Have you done any work with dating rock art?
I have not done any work on dating rock art. It's possible some of these methods that I use and my colleagues use could be done to do that, if there was the right collaboration to sensitively do that.
I was interested in what's your favorite dating method? You've talked about 3 different kinds. You got the cosmics, you got the radiocarbon, and then you got these DNA molecules. Can you tell us something about the ranges of each of those?
Yeah, the DNA is interesting. So people do actually use sort of evolution and DNA work to back out timing of things based on how things mutate and evolve. People have turned that into a dating method of sorts. I tend to like ones that are maybe more based in physics, like based on a half-life that we know hasn't changed, or this outer space crazy thing with the cosmic radiation is also something that's been quite well worked out and is based on accumulation rates that we can constrain in time. Radiocarbon dating has a limit of 50,000 years ago. It can be used up to almost today. But you need organic material for carbon dating. You need a cave bone or a shell in a sediment section or a plant fossil that's in a sediment core. So there's advantages to that one. The cosmogenic dating requires rock surfaces, but there's a lot of requirements there too. Like if a glacial boulder rolls after any time between the Ice Age and today, shows over for that dating method on that sample, because that's got to be exposed skyward the whole time since deposition. So each one has pluses and minuses, and I guess I'm gonna cop out to your question and say I don't have a favorite, but I do have a favorite approach, which is the more you can use to assemble the scientific story, the better.
On most of the or on all of your graphs, it excludes Glacier Bay. Is that because Bechtel is a Forest Service guy and he doesn't go to Glacier Bay, or is there another reason? And your graph says Juneau is the big jumper. Of course, there's there in Glacier Bay. So does that suggest, or that the center of the glacier in all of Southeast Alaska was Juneau? It was the thickest part of the glacier was Juneau, and then what about that way, in the Glacier Bay way?
Yeah, that's a good question. The ice load during the last ice age, we don't know very well. And in fact, what we need to do is we need to team up with more ice sheet modelers to be like, okay, based on everything you know, if you put a load over Southeast Alaska that looked as realistic as we think as it did, what does that do to the crust? And can we replicate or simulate this rebound in the Juneau area? I should say that it's like I say the word Juneau, but it's really the broader Juneau area, and those plots you can see that the data with the high sea level is a broad area around Juneau that includes Glacier Bay. Glacier Bay is covered, or was recently covered, by so much ice that we don't always have the best records for the Ice Age wakening up interval. So if we want to try to find places that popped out of the ocean, these aren't places that are now or recently have been covered by ice, because the glaciers recently have removed the geologic evidence of the former period of sea level change. That's probably why Glacier Bay is like omitted, or like a kind of a data gap for that reason.
Thank you very much for your presentation. So is there any, thinking about the land rising, glacial rebound, then in theory, rivers and streams are going to begin to dry up, become smaller, maybe overtaken by more brush. I guess what I'm getting at, is there any correlation to the loss of salmon streams, and will that continue into the future?
That's a great question. Anytime that there's a drastic change in a coastline, you have the potential to influence habitats, the configuration of bays, in fishing migration patterns. So it's possible that 10 feet in the last couple hundred years, I assume that rate is continuing. There was a major change in Glacier Bay itself, but the bullseye of uplift is not unique to just Glacier Bay, where the glacier is like calved out of that giant fjord. It's kind of a broader symptom of ice getting thinner and thinner. In another 100 or 200 years, are we going to have another 10 feet collectively? Could that be enough to change the course of some rivers? Possibly, probably not the big ones, I wouldn't think. The glacier retreat itself would also similarly affect river courses. Clearly, glaciers that have the ability to dam rivers in the past may not in the future, or like this unfortunate geography by Mendenhall Glacier, where glacier recession has led to a new ice-dammed lake and all these yokel alps. So clearly there can be a lot of reorganization of rivers independent from sea level, but related to glacier change too. So yeah, it's a great question. I think if I had to guess, it would be not so much rivers turning on or off, but maybe the configuration of the coastline and maybe changing where the fish go.
In your last few slides, you threw in kind of the coastal migration route or the overland migration route. Do you have a theory on which was first, or where our ancestors may have originated, whether that be coastal here or through that ice gap? Right,
that's a good question. Probably everywhere, all at once. I could see there, if both areas are open, there's seafaring ancestry that would make that a logical place for people to be and have lived and thrived. Similarly, there's inland areas and more, like game and nomadic kind of cultures that could be thriving there. So, yeah.
Any last questions? Yeah. Well, if you have any closing remarks, you're welcome to provide them. Otherwise, thank you very much for sharing your knowledge, and what a wonderful presentation. Thank you.